waiting for the cue that they're ready to start recording. Oh, perfect. So let me do a little bit of introduction, because most of you probably know Ross, hopefully, Ross Video, but I'm sure most of you don't know me. So my name's Jenn Jarvis, and for Ross Video, I work with Inception, which is our NRCS and social media management tool. But previous to that, since we all kind of have a past and a history, I worked on the content side of things. So I was that annoying reporter or producer asking you to do something or to fix something. So I worked as a multi-platform reporter, and we're going to talk about what multi-platform means. Then I was a social media and web producer. So I was creating content for all of those different platforms. Newsroom manager, and then now I've been working with Ross for about 2.5 years now on developing their NRCS and social media management. So we're going to be talking about multi-platform content, and to me that encompasses any platform or format where we need to distribute content to our audience. So in some cases, you know, I've got broadcast up here. That's really familiar to most of you guys. That's your comfort zone. There's a lot of established workflows and kind of general practices in that area. Of course, it's always changing, and that's why we're here. We're learning about the new things. But really, everything below broadcast, this is kind of the new stuff. This is what we're figuring out, and this is what I'm going to kind of focus on talking about. How do we integrate web, mobile, social media into our workflow? And you notice I mentioned whatever comes next. The whole thing about multi-platform is that it's constantly changing. So what I tell you today may not even be true in a couple weeks from now. The world of social media and web, in my opinion, has a much faster kind of development rate than some of the other traditional platforms that we've worked with. So when you look at things like Facebook. So Facebook's been around for 11 years now, which is actually a pretty long time when you think about how recently we've really started to take it seriously in the broadcast world. But in those 11 years, it has changed significantly. So the way that Facebook was 11 years ago is not the way that it is now. And so with social media, we're really looking at a 3 to 6 month almost development cycle, because that's really how frequently those platforms are making significant changes or updates to how we can push content to them or receive content from them. So Facebook, we're looking at, it's been around for about 11 years, so it's kind of the grandfather of social media. Twitter is a little bit newer, so we're at about 9 years with Twitter. Instagram, a little bit newer than that. YouTube, which I don't have listed here, but still a very big player, is at about 10 years. And then we're always looking for what's next. So kind of the next things on the horizon right now, there are a lot of platforms popping up for live streaming video that specifically connect to social media. Snapchat's a big one, so it's not just for teenagers anymore. A lot of big broadcasters are starting to take it seriously. Okay, so here's the problem with multi-platform content. Whether we are talking about publishing, so we're delivering content to our audience, or we're talking about ingesting or pulling content in from our audience. The #1 complaint that I've heard as I've traveled around the world, actually, and been in newsrooms, is there's too many windows and there's too many tabs. There are too many programs that I have to connect to. If I want to get something from Facebook to an on-air graphic, I have to go through 20 steps. And we all know that your journalists can be very, very impatient. I can say that about them because I used to be one of them. So the fewer steps that you can give them, first of all, the more work that you can do with fewer resources, and that's definitely a goal for a lot of us. You're definitely going to get a lot less complaining from them if you can make their workflow easier. It's also going to decrease the amount of time that it takes in a live breaking news situation from when we find or discover this piece of content, we're actually sharing it on the air. Okay, so a multi-platform workflow needs to connect the major systems and platforms that your content creators interact with every day. Okay? So that's kind of my blanket statement as a goal. Think about it as all of those different places where your newsroom staff are logging in or where they're looking for pieces of information. So some of this is content that we own. It's internal to us. It's our video that we shoot. It's our stories that we write, that we report with our original reporting skills where we're actually making those phone calls and doing those interviews. Those are going to be stored within our internal systems, our databases, our servers. The other piece of content that we have is content that we're going to ingest from outside our newsroom. So this is not content that we necessarily own, but it is a source of information. So a recent statistic, well, I've seen some pretty wide-ranging statistics, actually. I've seen everything from 10 upwards of 25%. Information that we report in the news, I've seen statistics saying anywhere from 10 to 25% of that information originates on social media in some form. So sometimes that's a piece of video that we're taking from Facebook. Sometimes that is a tweet that we're taking to show an opinion or context. But really, it could just be that that is our news tip. So news tips used to come in via phone or via email or having a conversation with someone at a coffee shop. This is kind of the new news tip line. Twitter, Facebook, people can post on our Facebook walls. They can tweet at us. They can send us direct messages with all of these news tips. Because the bottom line is our viewers, and I don't say this in a mean way, but they're kind of lazy. They're lazy in a sense that they're not always going to meet us where we want them to meet us. They're not going to go to our website all of the time because that may not be something that they feel comfortable doing. That may not be a destination that they go to regularly. But if they're already on Twitter and they're already on Facebook all of the time, checking and chatting with their friends, that is a comfortable native platform for them to interact with us. So the reality is your journalists are getting more and more of their tips, more and more of their information from social media. It's starting there. And then we need a way to take that information and integrate it into our traditional broadcast workflow. So the last point up here is, I think, one of the most important. We need the ability to do the bulk of this work, whether it's, in this case it says publishing, but even the content discovery, the searching and the ingesting. We need to be able to do this, or at least originate the process from one primary workspace, because that's going to solve that complaint that we had, that number one complaint that I've seen where people are saying, I have too many tabs, too many windows, too many usernames and passwords. If we can give them one primary UI that is going to connect to all of these different systems, not necessarily own the content, but allow us to peek in and see the content, to move the content from one place to another, this is going to make their lives a lot easier and solve a lot of the problems that we have. So first I like to talk about ingest, because I think this is kind of the forgotten piece. When I see people talk about multi-platform workflow, I see a lot of discussions about publishing. So how do I take the content that we own and push it out? And there are a ton of tools on the market for publishing to multiple platforms at one time. But what I don't see people spend as much time talking about is how do I ingest content from all of these platforms and make it easy to use? What I'm hoping to do today is give you guys a few ideas, a few things to think about so that when you're investigating the right solution for your facility, as far as how you integrate this, you know basically 2-3 things that you need to keep in mind. What are the most important things that I need to be looking for when I'm evaluating potential solutions for this? So if we're talking about ingesting content, I'm pulling in stuff from the outside world. Wires is a big one. That's pretty traditional. So a lot of times that's coming into our NRCS. That's pretty normal. The trick with that is I need to easily be able to take that content from my wires and push it back out to social media, not just plop it into a VO that's going in my 5 p.m. newscast. So wires needs to kind of have that cross-platform connection. RSS and XML feeds. So again, what we're trying to avoid is all these tabs and windows. So if I'm checking the same websites every day for pieces of information, updates from the DOT about construction or traffic accidents, different media sources that maybe we're partners with so I can monitor them for information that I can use. A lot of times I can actually pull that information in and monitor it via an RSS feed. So RSS has kind of fallen in and out of favor over the last few years, but it's still a really great way to monitor a lot of sources of information in one space and see it in one space. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, so these are kind of examples of our social media platforms, but of course there's even more than that. There's YouTube, there's soon to be possibly Snapchat or Pinterest or a dozen other sites that are kind of hovering on the fringes of being kind of those mainstream broadcast contributors. So we need to be able to pull in content from them. There are free ways to do it now. I can go to facebook.com, I can find a comment I like, I can take a screenshot, I can copy and paste the content into something. But that's what we're trying to avoid. We're trying to find a way to streamline that process. So we need to be able to ingest content from all these platforms. Email is a big one. We still operate in newsrooms in a very serious way with email. It's really primarily what we're using for internal communication in a lot of cases. It's not true of every organization. Some are using messaging within their NRCS. Some are using another chat system that they've implemented. But email or some form of messaging, we still need that internal communication amongst ourselves so that we can have those editorial discussions about what to use and what not to use. But that needs to be integrated into our workflow so that we have that shared information, because having our email or our messaging completely separate from the UI where we're building the content means that sometimes we're having to save those files and re-ingest them. Sometimes we're having discussions about we are going to use this or we aren't going to use this, and that's not getting captured in the primary workspace where we're actually creating the content. So really, the idea here is if you literally had your content creator sit down and create a list of all of the spaces where they're looking for information. So where are we discovering information that we can then act on to create our own content? That's really the list of things that you need to have connected to whatever your primary workspace is going to be. Okay, so then let's talk about kind of our internal connections. So those databases and servers and that we own. So this is where we're creating content that we have ownership of. So the NRCS, I think, has kind of traditionally been sort of the core, which we kind of spoke everything around when we're talking about content creation. So that's a big piece of the puzzle. The CMS has been around for a long time, your content management system where you're pushing content to your website. So the CMS is kind of the second oldest, I guess, in this tier or list of platforms that we're connecting to. Then we have social media, and I have social media listed as one thing here, but no social media platform is the same, unfortunately, because they are separate companies with different philosophies. We can't always get them all to communicate in the same way. Now, like everything else, there are some standards that are being adopted, but things like the format of video that you post, the amount of characters that you have is going to be different across every platform. But internally, if we are publishing to Twitter and Facebook, what are we using? What system are we using? What program are we using to do that? And can we connect it to our NRCS and to our CMS? Graphics, this is a big one. So with graphics, sometimes we need to take a graphic and push it out to social media. So if we have this great map of where something happened, a big news story, or we have a nice infographic that shows the change in, our school district funding over the last 5 years. We may want to push that out to social media, but also we're going to want to ingest content from social media and put it on the air. So that's becoming more and more common. A recent statistic I saw said anywhere between 30 to 40% of viewers have participated or interacted with television content in some way. So while you may be sitting at home watching some of these more reality shows or competition shows or morning newscasts and you're thinking, well, I would never tweet to tell them what I thought about a certain topic, there are a lot of people who would. So it's becoming more and more common for people to have that third screen experience. So they're watching television, but they are interacting with it with some kind of handheld device to give their opinion or their thoughts on the subject. So with graphics, we're talking about a two-way street, publishing out our content and pulling in information from Twitter and Facebook to be able to publish in some kind of ticker or full-screen graphic. Video and our archives as well, it's kind of the same thought process. We're always going both ways with this content. So with our video, if we shoot video and we own it, we may need to publish it out to Facebook or Twitter. But if a viewer posts a video to Twitter or to Instagram, how do we get that video in so that we can take ownership of it and redistribute it to all of our platforms? I put planning and messaging on here. Messaging I mentioned a little bit earlier, so with that kind of email or internal messaging, how do we connect that so that we're seeing basically all of our information, all of our discussions in the same UI? But planning, I think, falls really high on this list as well. If we know that an event is happening today, and we know who the key players are, and what crews we're going to have covering different aspects of this, the people who are creating all of our content, not just our TV content, but our web and social media content, need to know what kind of resources they're going to have available as well. Especially because our social media platforms, we're going to be reporting as that event's happening. So with broadcast, a lot of times we're still waiting for those evening shows to tell you what happened during that event. But if I'm the social media manager and the event starts at noon, well, if we're live streaming it, I need to know that I need to be sending out a tweet at 11:50 to alert our viewers that that live stream is going to be available at noon. So it's very important to have your planning, whatever you're using for planning, your calendar, your list, whatever it is that you're using for planning, integrated into kind of this communication that we're creating. Okay, so once we have all of these systems connected, I already mentioned this, there should be a primary workspace where I can browse all of my available information and assets and pieces. So basically see all of the things that I can use and then create that content and then publish it out. So again, the primary workspace that we're creating may not actually be owning some of this content, so it may not be stored on that server, but it should be able to access it, should be able to see it, and it should be able to push it out to where it needs to go. And that's really important because, remember, it's solving that problem of having all the different windows and tabs, of having to save, of having to copy and paste. We want to just easily be able to move and repurpose content with as few steps as possible. Okay, so here's kind of the takeaways. So this is kind of summing it up. What do we need if we're going to create a multi-platform workflow? We need a portable, easily accessible workspace. So this is something that's kind of come up already a little bit today. The reality is more and more of our content creation is happening outside of the newsroom. So in the past, we could have all of these systems neatly connected inside our building, unless you have multiple spaces, then it gets a little more complicated. But if we have one kind of central newsroom, we can connect it all within our building and take ownership of it that way. But the reality is we need our field crews to be able to access this content, and especially if they're working on a mobile device, so they're working on a laptop, they're working on an iPad or a cell phone. We really need to keep them from having to jump between windows and tabs and apps. Remember all of these usernames and passwords. We need to make it as simple as possible because the smaller the device, the more clunky it is to have to jump between all of these workspaces, copy and paste this content, and remember all of these passwords. The other thing is when you have kind of this centralized UI that they're using, this centralized workspace, it actually gives you guys more control. One thing that we're seeing a lot with social media, if we're just using native Facebook.com or native Twitter.com to allow our reporters and producers to publish content or to discover content, first of all, we have to share our username and password on some of these platforms with our entire news staff. which means as our staff changes, we're having to change that password frequently, or we just kind of run the risk of opening it up and giving people access to it that may not need access. So this is kind of when I start thinking about people like interns or video editors who see that username and password posted up on somebody's desk, and we like to hope that people aren't going to do things that maybe they haven't been authorized to do. But it's way too common that, especially in a crazy breaking news situation, when we're trying to get that content out, somebody is potentially posting something that they shouldn't on social media. So when you create this kind of primary workspace that you're using, where I'm using one login to publish to all these different platforms, it gives you the control of hopefully creating some kind of user permissions, so giving people appropriate access to the platforms they need, and that's definitely something you should be looking at when you're evaluating potential options. So it's kind of this fine line. We want it to be easily accessible and portable. We want them to be able to be out in the field and using it on a variety of devices and platforms. But we also want to maintain some control, and that's come up a little bit today as well. If I have a piece of video, where is it okay to publish that video? If I'm pushing something out to Twitter, who am I going to allow to have access to publish that piece of content to Twitter? And when we are kind of maintaining the UI where all of this is happening, instead of just pushing people out to all of these individual platforms where they're just logging in directly, that can give us some more ownership and some more control over the kind of access that we're giving people. Because the goal is ultimately to protect you guys. So if we're talking about things that we need when we're creating this multi-platform workflow, a portable, easily accessible workspace, connections between our primary systems. We talked about that before. So again, when you're looking at these options that exist to create these multi-platform workflows, how many of your systems can they connect to? How do they connect to those systems? What kinds of information are they sharing back and forth? That's a really, really important question to ask when you're evaluating these options. So connections to our internal systems, and then a pathway to our primary publishing locations. Okay, so this is another important thing to ask when you're looking at these options and evaluating these options. How do we get content out to the public? So with broadcast, we kind of know how that happens. We have a workflow in place. But if we're sending things out to Facebook or Twitter or YouTube, how is that happening? Where is that content being stored before it hits Facebook? What kind of access are we going to give to people? And then the last thing, consistent updates and improvements. So at the beginning, I talked a little bit about how rapidly social media changes. You really have two options when you're creating a multi-platform workflow. You can either look at something that's been built by a vendor, like Ross Video or another company, or you can build your own product. And I've seen things go both ways, of course. In either situation, whether you are purchasing a solution or you are building your own solution, you need to keep in mind, how often is this realistically going to be updated? Because what is true for social media now is not going to be true for social media or web workflows in a few weeks even. So if you are working with a vendor company, I would ask them, what does your development schedule look like? How often are you updating this program? And not just little bug fixes either. How often are you making significant improvements? How often are you adding connections to new platforms? That's a very valid question because we're always needing to add and to innovate. If our viewers are using this platform, we need to be able to connect to them there and integrate them into this great multi-platform workflow that we've created. The other question, well, and I should mention, if you're planning to build this workflow yourselves, be prepared to do constant work on it. And I think that's probably the biggest deterrent for most organizations doing the work themselves, is it's never finished. You think you've finished that Facebook integration, but then Facebook goes in and changes their API or their developers platform, and you have to essentially redo the work. So just kind of keep in mind, it's a constant thing. Even with the older social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, that are much more developed and stable, they're still making improvements and changes. So you're adding new platforms, but you're also redeveloping to current platforms. So the last point here is there an API? And I think this is something that's a good takeaway for all of you. Even if you're purchasing a system, because every single one of you is going to be involved with an organization that has a slightly different workflow and uses slightly different solutions for a lot of the things that we need to do as a broadcast organization. You need to be prepared to customize. So most newsroom systems and social media management tools that are designed for broadcasters should give you the ability to customize your connection points, customize how you're pulling data in and how you're pushing data out. So if you don't have someone within your organization that can essentially write an app, you should probably look for some kind of resource that can help you with that can assist you with that. Because realistically moving forward, that's kind of how a lot of systems are going to be positioning themselves, is here's the product that we're presenting you with. It's probably going to do about 90% of what you need it to, and then you have the ability to build those small custom integrations that are unique to your organization or to your workflow. So most products will hand you documentation on their API and a software developer's kit with some examples, but you need to be prepared internally within your organization or have someone that you can contract out to that can help you build those last few little pieces that you need or those last few connection points that you need. Okay, so anybody have questions? If not, that just means it's a little extra time for our last speaker. Well, if you guys think of anything, feel free to grab me at lunch, or I'll be around, this evening and tomorrow, and I'd be happy to chat with you. Thank you so much.